Introducing my guest tonight is simply a major undertaking. Professor Achille Mbembe, with that beautiful Cameroonian name, comes to us from South Africa, and we are also privileged to enjoy him and have remarkable intellectual dialogues with him only because he's a visiting professor at Harvard University. I could say many things about Professor Achille Mbembe, but I essentially want to highlight two important matters that my viewers, thousands of you, ought to know. In my judgment, in my philosophical judgment, my guest tonight, I consider to be the leading post-colonial cultural theorist who is roaming and rocking the African cultural landscape after Frantz Fanon, a luminary of luminaries on whom he has written and reflected quite considerably. And a major portion of the interview is going to be his reflections and assessments on Fanon and how it applies to the South African situation. Professor Achille Mbembe is a graduate of the Sorbonne, one of the most prestigious universities in France. He's the author of numerous books, and most particularly, Postcolony is one of his seminal books which has been translated into many languages. If time permits, towards the end, I may ask him a few questions or so about that important book so that my audience would immediately go to the bookstores and begin reading this most important statement on the African condition. So without any further words, let me go right to the interview and begin having a conversation with my guest, Professor Achille Mbembe. How delighted I am and somehow starstruck to bring you to African Ascent for the first time. Welcome to African Ascent.
I'm very happy to be here.
So what I thought we should talk about is this idea of apartheid. The news media occasionally remembers it, but in African history, apartheid is as phenomenal as the Holocaust was for the Jewish condition. So if I can indulge your kindness, I would like to begin the interview by you giving us a crash course on apartheid.
Apartheid means separation or separateness. Is the ideology of the most racist state that modernity has produced, which was South Africa. White settlers arrived in South Africa in the mid-17th century. They immediately proceeded to dispossess those who owned the land. They took the land, they appropriated the cattle, the means of life. They did this, subjected a number of those groups into slavery, moved in the hinterland, and with the discovery of gold and diamond in the beginning of the 20th century, they managed to build in South Africa a very sophisticated industrial system that rested on the exploitation of black labor through the system of labor migration. They then disenfranchised most blacks, reduced them to live in Bantustans, the equivalent of enclaves or reserves, and subjected them to some of the most atrocious conditions that had existed on Earth at that period of time. All of these triggered, of course, a major nationalist movement propelled by the African National Congress, and the whole struggle led in 1994 to the abolition of apartheid and the institution in South Africa of a democratic dispensation.
And then it must have taken some heroic efforts on the part of South African natives and others to dismantle apartheid. And of course, our most prominent African leader, Nelson Mandela, played a major role. Perhaps you can briefly describe what Mandela's efforts resulted in and where we are now in South Africa, 20 years later.
Of course, as you say, the regime of racial segregation and cruelty triggered massive resistance from the African people. They organized themselves under the umbrella of the African National Congress, which was celebrating last year its centenary. It's the oldest liberation movement in the continent. It fought through various means, as it happened elsewhere in colonial context, first of all peacefully, petitioning, organizing demonstrations, educating the people, all of which was repressed atrociously by the then white minority government. They banned the ANC as well as other organizations, and the ANC went underground. Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent 27 years on Robben Island, but the people never forgot his name. He became, through incarceration, the living spirit of the struggle. They held on until the white minority government was forced to negotiate with the ANC. Right now, Mandela is on his last leg of a long walk to freedom. He turned 95 years old in July. As many of your followers on this program might know, his health is not very good, but his spirit will be with us until the end of times.
Have you ever had the privilege to
Yes,
meet
I did.
Nelson Mandela directly?
I did meet him. I did meet him a number of times in the context of the work done for his foundation. He is an amazing human being. He is very funny. He is extremely thoughtful and easygoing. He achieved in prison a kind of internal peace and serenity and freedom very few human beings have ever achieved. And if he were to go tomorrow morning, I think he would certainly go in peace, which doesn't mean that he wouldn't be worried about what he leaves behind.
Of course. And now I would like us to begin talking about a very broad topic, which I must confess to you is very dear to my heart. If there are a few thinkers that I love in this world. Frantz Fanon is one of them. And I noticed that I and you share a passion for Frantz Fanon. Why do you like him so much?
Fanon was the epitome of intelligence, high velocity intelligence. And he was the epitome of self-sacrifice, of a man who was born in the Caribbean, the French Caribbean, who took part to, he witnessed what war meant. he fought against the Germans because he was a French citizen. And then he went to Algeria, where he witnessed something horrific that looked like genocide. The war waged by France against Algerian nationalists. He witnessed this, and he decided that he would take side with the Algerians. He would become an Algerian among Algerians. He exhibited in all this process an indomitable spirit that very few black thinkers have exhibited. And he died young, at age 36, but he left behind him a very rich heritage we have hardly begun to explore, whose significance for the times we live in is still manifest.
There are those, Achille, who passionately argue that the wretched of the earth was really addressing itself to apartheid. And in that, although the idea of wretchedness was a metaphor that Fanon used to discuss the continental, African and third world condition, there are those who up until now insist that what propelled him to write the wretched of the earth is what you have appropriately called the most consecrated, the most perfect system of human subjugation that was ever created, which was apartheid. Would they be correct in this assessment, do you think, or do they decontextualize the wretched of the earth?
I think that that is a correct assessment. If we understand apartheid, of course, as a historical example of subjugation and the negation of the humanity of black people in South Africa, but also in many other parts of the modern world. The fact that black humanity has been put in question in ways probably not experienced elsewhere, short of those historical examples of extermination which happened in the United States of America, in Australia, New Zealand, and some other parts of the world. So in that sense, the rest of the earth and a huge part of Fanon's critical reading of his times has at its center the dramatic question of apartheid, meaning what is it that we do share as human beings, and why is it that we invest so much in separation and denial of the human in the other. But I also think that the power of Fanon's thought or thinking originates from the fact that maybe more than any other modern thinker, he endeavored to create the conditions which would allow us to imagine a world free of the burden of race. And that the idea of a world free of the burden of race has been quite central to black thought and black political practice in the US, in Brazil, in Africa, in Europe today, and it is still dilemma modern liberal democracies have not entirely resolved.
While preparing for this interview, and I must tell you that I worked as hard as I could to understand the architectonics of your project. It is so intricate because you're young, you're still working out a programmatic vision for the African condition, following the tradition that Fanon has established for us. I came across two original tropes, categories or schemas that Fanon was the first to introduce, I learned in this address that he gave at Harvard, namely the race trauma and its companion, the freedom trauma. I would like us to begin talking, please take as much time as you would like to, so that my audience could learn from you about what Fanon meant by the race trauma.
By the race trauma, Fanon meant two things. First, he meant the power that dominant groups arrogate for themselves, the power to assign the other to some fixed racial identity that forces them to live their lives almost always in a subordinated position within the social, political, economic, and cultural structures of their times. So that power of violation and assignation creates, according to Fanon, a whole series of psychological, psychic trouble, wounds, which then start defining the individual who is subjected to this kind of violation. Violation, one major result of which is the loss of an autonomous sense of the self, and more worryingly, the loss of any sense of self-dignity. So that's the first meaning of the concept of racial trauma in Fanon's work. The second meaning of racial trauma has to do, according to Fanon, with the internalization of this false image of oneself that is fabricated, manufactured by the dominants. Its internalization and the fact that we begin to live our lives as if that lie was true. And therefore, we lose in the process the possibility of emerging in history as the actors, the agents of our own destiny. So most of the work of Fanon aims at, first of all, finding the ways in which we can heal that trauma. And second, heal it in order to recreate the conditions for us to take, first of all, to stand tall and proud, and to take charge of our own lives, and to shape our own history according to our own volition, and not the whims and caprices of anybody else.
I see. Now, this brings me to want to reflect more deeply than what I read on the popular news media about South Africa. In your judgment, this is partly a historical question and partly a cultural question. How conversant do you think were the original founders of the ANC with Fanon's work?
Oh, they all read Fanon. They could quote him while sleeping. They read him, studied him, just as they read some other important black thinkers within the critical tradition of black thought, of course. Fanon was also read, or is being reread today. He's being reread in a number of social movements, most of which are not very happy with where things are right now. He's being read by a lot of young people in universities.
Really?
He's being rediscovered. He's having an afterlife. He's being read in a context in which, as it has happened elsewhere in the continent and in the rest of the so-called third world, in a context in which after decolonization, the former liberation movements tend to turn themselves into electoral machines, tend to be more preoccupied with accumulation rather than with creating the conditions for the kind of freedom they fought for. In South Africa in particular, Fanon is being rediscovered at a time when many realize that the promise of liberation is somewhat forestalled by the fact that the deep economic structures of apartheid have not been dismantled, and that black life is still very cheap. Yes. And that the fruits of black labor, those fruits are not equally shared. So the question of equal share and equal opportunity for a life of dignity in one's own land, those questions are re-emerging as very contentious political questions today.
Amazing. Also, I learned a very astute observation that you made and through which you began your reflections on Fanon in that Du Bois lecture, in which you began arguing for the contemporaneity of Fanon by paraphrasing a certain article that appeared in the Left Review, I believe, which he contended misunderstood Fanon very deeply. What was that misunderstanding? As you know, the left and the Marxists broadly understood do not like Fanon. They always think that Fanon's obsession with race is coming at the expense of displacing class, whereas in that presentation, to my great satisfaction, in fact, what you did towards the end is you made Fanon acutely aware of the accumulation of value, the process of exploitation, the wastage of black bodies, the tension and contradictions between wealth and poverty, and his advocacy that this tension between wealth and poverty must be surmounted first, and in that race, what we call race, is nothing more than a component of it. It's not in tension with it, rather it is a component of it. As he put it in The Nature of the Earth, what he argued for is not the replacement of race by class, but simply stretching it to create a space for race.
That is indeed what he does. He's not negating the importance of class. He is like, in fact, many black thinkers who underwent this colonial experience. He is fully aware of the fact that the relationship between class and race is one of, I would say, co-constitution, that they mutually constitute each other, and that the crux of the matter is to cut through that process of co-constitution and to tease out the ways in which this process is deployed in very specific historical contexts. The idea is not to privilege one at the expense of the other. The idea is to stretch, as you said, the two categories, in fact, in order to be able to account for the fact that historically capitalism, in fact, in order for it to operate functionally, has always been in need of something we can call racial subsidies. There's no capitalist system that has not operated with racial subsidies in the various forms. Form of unpaid labor under slavery in the Americas, in the form of the mass incarceration of bodies that have become superfluous, in the form of the migrant labor system in South Africa, whereby people have to pay for their own exploitation through the fact that they cannot live in the cities, the fact that for their own survival, wages are not enough. Subsistence agriculture has to be added to it. So capitalism without racial subsidies is something that is unthinkable, and it seems to me that Fanon, that's the intuition he had, which helped him indeed to open up a way to imagine class itself in a way that is richer than what we have inherited from the classical Marxist tradition.
Quite right. And hence the sentence, that famous sentence in The Writer of the Earth, in which Fanon says in the colonies, one is rich because one is white, one is poor because one is black, or one is black because one is poor, and one is rich because one is white.
Because indeed, questions of wealth and poverty are inseparable both at national and international level from questions of race, or if you want, of racialization. But we also see, to come back to South Africa, the quintessential example of what used to be a racial state. We see at play today that dialectics of race and class, if only in the sense that since 1994 we have witnessed the emergence of a substantial black middle class. We have also witnessed a fracturation of the black community in the sense that various orders of stratification are very visible today within that otherwise old historical bloc. We witness the fact that the country has moved from being a society of order and control to a society of consumption, where objects have become like the new comrades of those who have money, while those who do not have money are still living in abject poverty. So all of that, it seems to me, forces us to think anew about the race-class relations in ways that are even more complicated today than maybe at the times of Fanon.
Okay. In fact, there are those who argue that your book, Postcolony, complicates this dynamic between race and class, and much more fundamentally, what you call this waste of human existence, because the devices of human exploitation have become subtly changed from overt forms of exploitation at the point of production, a la Marx, to this subtle condemnation of human beings to the trauma of race, a la Fanon. And now a very complex relationship between these two, a la Mbembe's work, Postcolony. What are the arguments of Postcolony? Why is it that people think that it is the most seminal work that has hit the African cultural landscape after The Wretched of the Earth? High honor.
On the Postcolony, the book was written in a Fanonian spirit. Fanon was the direct interlocutor of the book. I wanted to ask the same kinds of questions Fanon asked during the colonial period. I wanted to ask those kinds of questions to what came after colonialism. I wanted to assess whether or not colonialism had indeed ended, and whether the project that underpinned so many struggles, the fact of so many lives being lost in that struggle, so much energy being mobilized, I wanted to assess where all of that had gone, what had happened to that archive. And underpinning this project was also the hope of possibly finding out what were the fault lines, the cracks in the times of ours that could be inhabited in the attempt at creating a new project of freedom and of democracy, insofar as the fate of democracy in places such as ours rested very squarely on its capacity to retrieve the human from a long history of waste. And that seems to me to still be the challenge, especially when speaking from a place like South Africa. How is it that we can create a political order, an order of culture, in which the human is indeed saved from the logic of waste that has been a central dynamic of our history for so many centuries? And I believe that it's a question that has a lot of pertinence in this age of neoliberalism, an age in which, once again, the logic of capital, its ultimate logic is to turn the human into a thing, or if you want, into a code, since now everything is somewhat digitalized.
Okay. In the Postcolony, and also other seminal articles that you've written, you also invoke in a masterly way, in my judgment, the relevance and contributions of Foucault. And you're most particularly attracted to the idea of biopower, biopolitics, which you contend is increasingly becoming inadequate to understand the intricacies of the human subjugation, which led you to develop a complementary category, which you call necropower, necropolitics. How are you using these two devices to address the question of human waste in South Africa and in Africa as a whole, where you see human life literally being wasted when you wake up every day in South Africa and look at one of the most functional and powerful and resourceful African states, and yet the beneficiaries of this functionality are, empirically speaking, so few, because its victims are subject to what you call, using Heideggerian term, the power of death, the power of Dasein.
You're right. Foucault, in a book called Society Must Be Defended, paid attention to the question of race. And developed the idea that in the history of the West, of course, there were many different forms of power that came not necessarily in succession, but genealogies of power were quite distinct. One could clearly identify a period of the history of the West when the dominant form of power was a disciplinary kind of power, a kind of power that acts on bodies, a kind of power, the aim of which is to subjugate those bodies, not in order to exterminate them, but in order to extract from them maximum productivity, put them to work, force them to obey to a set of regularities, domesticate them for the purpose of the maximization of wealth creation. And then he's talking about a shift from that type of power to a different kind of power that rests on the management of life, of the bios, the Greek term which refers to life. So the politics of life. Where then what power does is to basically create the conditions either to maximize life through very concrete policies, I mean sanitation, hygiene, housing, all of that. So either to maximize it or for some and expose others to disaster, if one wants. And then he argues that in that context, in the context in which the purpose of power is to maximize life, the only reason why life can be, certain categories of people can be put to death, the only reason is racism. That in a democracy, racism is the only reason why one can be put to death. And then he goes on to argue that, of course, the most perfect example of the racist state is the Nazi state. And Foucault is writing in the 70s, at a time when the only existing historical racist state is South Africa. And of course, it never mentions South Africa, which is, now we know, quite typical of some of those brilliant philosophers, the work of them. But that's another question for another discussion. Now, what I tried to do in that article you refer to was to take seriously what Foucault is talking about, the question of the politics of life, and to try to understand why is it that we witness in Africa, but also in many other places, such a massive sacrifice of life at a very high scale. I'll just give you a few examples recently. We are told that in Syria right now, more or less 100,000 people have been killed. There have been a number of wars going on in the Congo for the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, since the genocide in Rwanda, which killed between 800,000 people to 1 million. The wars in the Congo alone have led to the loss of at least 3 million lives. The wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, have resulted in just as many, let's say, high figures as the Congo. If one adds to that, of course, the number of those who have been mutilated, the number of those who have been incapacitated, so forth and so on. So massive production of death, yes, worldwide. So the question I asked was whether the concept of biopolitics is enough to account for these situations, which are not provisional situations. These are situations which have become normalized. It's normal today to lose so many people. So it's very clear that the concept of biopolitics doesn't help to account for this.
It's remarkable. It's also equally normal, correct me if I'm wrong, because we have been numbed, I think, to witness this waste of human existence and behave as if it's just flies that have died, which forces me to recall that brilliant observation that Fanon makes in The Wretched of the Earth, referring to the African condition, in which he says, no one knows when these natives are born, how and where they die. But they die, nevertheless. And I can imagine how traumatic it must be for you, this sensitive, acute observer of the South African condition, to see massive wealth on the one hand, and massive disappointment, massive squandering of early deaths in South Africa itself, in light of South African wealth, and in that even the ANC, the African National Congress, which came into power as an emancipator, perhaps for no fault of its own, but to a degree, indeed for fault of its own, is betraying the South African masses. And in that they are dying and no one really knows how, when, and why.
As the drama of living, let's say the paradox on the one hand of the exhilaration and disappointment that come from living in this place, I mean South Africa, because the stakes are somewhat high. If things do not go well in South Africa, the consequences for the entire continent and for the black world will be very massive. The black people will be respected in the world the moment Africa becomes capable of standing on its own
Self-sufficient.
feet. As long as Africa is not standing on its own feet, black people worldwide won't gain the respect they deserve. Whether they are president of the only superpower or whether they are, it won't matter. So the stakes are absolutely high. Africa has to become a power of its own once again. And for this to happen, we need places such as South Africa to succeed. That's why I am there. Not that I will make it happen, but I want to witness the making of this process.
That's why you made South Africa your home.
Yes. But of course, there's no illusion that things will be very difficult, as we can see and as you describe them. When one lives in South Africa, as in the rest of the continent, what is striking is the extraordinary amount of potential. The continent is a geological scandal. It has everything that one needs, all the resources that are needed to create massive wealth. And on the other hand, we witness the difficulties of making this happen. The task of critical thought is to inhabit those spaces of paradox, to inhabit them in a responsible manner, to create for oneself a position where one is free. Freedom of the mind, material freedom in the sense that one is not after I'm not after wealth, I'm not after prestige, and therefore I cannot be abused or captured in process of corruption. One has to inhabit all of that intellectually, ethically, and politically, and think from it. But think from it as part of a broader project of thinking about our world today. Where is our world going? What has happened to the foundational ideals embedded in our way of thinking? Questions of freedom, questions of justice, questions of sharing, questions of dignity, which were so central to the work of Fanon and a number of others. So it seems to me that is what calls for a new engagement, both with theory and with critique.
That's remarkable. We have come a full circle now. We have about 4 minutes left, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Fanon that I and you love dearly was both a pessimist, a brilliant pessimist, but also an equally brilliant optimist. And it's not an accident that his two tropes, the race trauma and the freedom trauma, complement one another. I would like our exciting interview to engage itself with what you called in that address that I enjoyed. I viewed it 2-3 times to master your thoughts. You're a great thinker you are, about the freedom trauma. Let's talk about the freedom trauma. You already did. You did hint at it when you were suggesting the way out, the transcendental moral arguments that you are making on the behalf of autonomy, the behalf of dignity, and the behalf of justice. What must happen in order for the freedom trauma to complement the race trauma, which is also simultaneously present in a post-apartheid South Africa? It would have to be.
There is if we keep thinking with Fanon, there's clearly a massive collective work that needs to be done. The very political work of organization, of education, of opening up of new horizons of imagination. The drama of South Africa right now is the shrinking of the imagination. So we have to reopen the horizons of imagination. And in this sense, arts, culture, aesthetics, all of that is absolutely important. And it pains me to see the extent to which the ANC government is so negligent when it comes to matters artistic and aesthetic. So that's the collective dimension. There is a very personal dimension Fanon was very interested in. And it has to do with the recomposition of one's psychic life. The reassembling of the fragments, because that's what race does. Race implodes the psychic, individual psychic. So the reassembling of these fragments in order to achieve a certain kind of condition in which we keep interrogating ourselves and the world in the process. Let's just think of the last sentences of Black Skin, White Mass.
Make me.
Oh, my body, make of me a man, a human being who constantly questions. And before he arrives at that moment of this amazing poem and a prayer, he has already told us this famous quote, "I am my own foundation." You can't have more optimistic than that. So I'm my own foundation, and because I'm my own foundation, and because, let's say, in order to become my own foundation, I have to keep things open to interrogation.
In short, correct me if I'm wrong, on the behalf of Fanon, what I have learned from you is that the subtle part of Fanon is that he was an articulator of a vision for the recomposition of the fractured black self globally. This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for Afghan Ascent.